Brianna Walden. I'm a junior here at Hillsdale College studying political economy, and it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker tonight. John E. Linder served as a U.S. representative for the state of Georgia. Prior to joining Congress, Representative Linder was educated at the University of Minnesota and served in the United States Air Force. During his time in Congress, Representative Linder held a number of leadership roles, including a ranking member of the Subcommittee on Income Security and Family Support on the House Ways and Means Committee. From 1996 to 1998, he joined the Republican Party leadership as chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee. Representative Linder sponsored the Fair Tax Act, first introducing the legislation in July of 1999 and reintroducing it in every subsequent session. He is the co-author of the Fair Tax book. Congressman Linder is very excited to engage in a conversation with us this evening and answer any questions that you have regarding the fair tax. So with that, please join me in welcoming Congressman John E. Linder.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. At this stage of my life, it's nice to be anywhere. I'm going to make a few brief comments. For the last 10 years I was in Congress, I don't think I ever gave a speech. And it startled a lot of people, but I would go to a Rotary Club or Kiwanis Club or Chamber of Commerce and just say, who's got the first comment or question? It usually startled them, but I learned more doing that than I would have speaking for 30 minutes. And I don't believe I've given a 30-minute speech in my life, so please be ready with questions. I want to thank Dan Mitchell for accommodating my flight schedule today and switching times with me from 4 to 8 so that I could be here on this evening. I want to thank him also for putting forth this afternoon a very serious and respectful proposal for a tax reform, the flat tax. In fact, I was a co-sponsor of the flat tax back in the 90s when Dick Armey was sponsoring it on a regular basis. But lately I've come to a different conclusion. I think we need to change directions. In fact, the tax that we have today, that you've come to know and love, is a flat tax on income 100 years later. And we flattened it out again big time in 1986, only to have amended it since then about 20,000 times. And to hope that future Congresses will leave Dan's flat tax alone reminds us of that proverbial third marriage, the victory of hope over experience. It isn't going to happen. So long as Congress knows how much you make and how you make it, they're going to try and get the rest. I've proposed a situation that has no idea how much you make and doesn't even care. The current system has given us a circumstance in this country where people in business make decisions for tax reasons rather than economic reasons. You've been there. You get up in the morning, you want to take care of your employees, your customers, your shareholders, and the person at the head of the table is a tax man with 72,000 pages of complications written by people who have never had a customer or an employee. Those decisions lead to inefficiencies that cost money out of our pockets. The current circumstance leads us to a situation where the tax foundation says that we are currently spending between $350 and $400 billion every year just filling out IRS forms. It costs a typical small business $724 to collect, comply, and remit $100. That isn't an inefficiency. That is stupid. It's like paying for a dead horse. You get nothing for it. We have driven into the underground economy $2 to $3 trillion a year, paying nothing to our government. We have today in offshore financial centers in dollar-denominated deposits between $15 and $20 trillion. Wanting to be in our economy and staying offshore because of the tax consequences of repatriation. I once asked Alan Greenspan, How long would it take for that money to be in our markets, in our banks? He said months. Why are we continuing to drive that money offshore? Last, we have today a set of circumstances that together provide a price system that is burdened with a 22% tax component. 22% of what you're currently spending at retail represents the embedded cost to the IRS. You're paying the income tax costs and the payroll tax costs, and the accountants and attorneys to avoid the tax costs of each of the thousands of companies it takes to get a loaf of bread to your table. From getting oil out of the ground to make gasoline, to getting steel or ore out of the ground to make steel, all of those businesses have costs. They have labor costs and travel costs and tax costs. And a study out of Harvard says that the tax component is 22%. We're competing in a global economy with a 22% tax component in our price system, making us less than competitive and driving jobs into offshore centers. And the lowest income people, you always hear about sales taxes hurting the lowest income. They're losing 22% of their purchasing power today to the current system. Any tax bill that nibbles around the edges of the current income tax system, whether it's the flat tax or any other iteration, and leaves the IRS in place, doesn't touch any of those things. The fair tax fixes them all. The fair tax is a single, universal, at the retail center, at the retail checkout, sales tax on the purchase of new goods and services. There's no tax on used goods. We think nothing should be taxed more than once. There's no tax on business activity. There's no tax on personal income, corporate income taxes, gift tax, death tax, alternative minimum tax, capital gains tax, dividend tax, all gone, along with the IRS. Currently, the average income earner is giving the federal government 23 cents of every dollar they earn. 15% income tax and 8% their share of the payroll tax. Under the fair tax, you give the government 23% of every dollar you spend. And if you don't spend it, you're not taxed on it. All taxes are gone. You get a $4 trillion 10-year tax cut by getting rid of the compliance costs. And you increase the purchasing power of all Americans through reductions in price and increases in take-home pay. But they'll get that 22% back. And we've become a global powerhouse because we'll be selling into a global economy without the tax component in our price system. Bill Archer, when he was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, used to quote a study that he had seen over and over that said 500 phone calls were made to international corporations whose headquarters were in Europe or Japan. And they were asked, what would you do in your long-term planning if the United States government eliminated all taxes on capital and labor and taxed only personal consumption? 80% said they'd build their next plant in the United States. And if you want to know the truth, if you're selling to Detroit, you'd rather be in Detroit because the transportation costs are immense. But because of the tax component in the price system, we're not there. And to make it all fair, because one of the things we learned in the $22 million worth of private research we had done, is the American people want to make sure you protect low-income folks. So we devised a prebate system. That's a rebate at the beginning of the month, not at the end. And the government transfers to every household based not on income, but based on the size of the household, a distribution sufficient to totally untax them on necessities. Now, we don't get in the business of defining necessities. I had a friend in Congress who was a supporter, but he wanted to make sure that we taxed potato chips and not potatoes. I said, that's the boat we're in now, picking winners and losers. So we took this definition of poverty level spending, which is defined as that spending necessary for a given size household to buy their essentials. That is the spending that we're rebating with the prebate. For a household of 4, you can spend $30,000 with no tax consequences. Beyond that, everybody pays the same. We're all voluntary taxpayers. And we pay taxes when we choose, as much as we choose, by how we choose to spend. The Fair Tax Bill has a provision for getting rid of the 16th Amendment. We don't believe it's feasible to do it in the bill to abolish the 16th Amendment, requiring a 2/3 vote. But what the language says is that if we repeal all the taxes on income and get rid of the IRS, and 7 years of enjoyment under the fair tax goes by and we haven't repealed the 16th Amendment, and as Dan said today, aggressively repeal it, all the income taxes come back. We think that you will put enough pressure on your members of Congress to encourage them to eliminate the 16th Amendment. I would hate to see what every other nation that went to a consumption tax has done, is have a little bit of both. Every nation that starts with a little bit of each winds up with a lot of both. And we can't get rid of one or the other. For so long as we've been taxing individuals in this country, we've only taxed wages. We've never taxed wealth. When Warren Buffett complains that his secretary was paying a higher tax rate than he was, it's because she worked for wages. First thing wealthy people do in their lives is stop getting wages. Live on capital gains and dividends that are taxed at a lower rate. There's a reason they're taxed at a lower rate, because you've already paid a higher rate on them for corporate income taxes. They've been taxed twice. We think that we should be taxing spent wealth rather than earned wages. This year, the federal government is going to get in income taxes about $2.3 trillion. We'll leave it said unsaid that we'll leave it aside that the government's going to spend about $1.6 trillion, more than that. We'll take that up at another time. But they're going to collect $2.3 trillion, and the fair tax would bring in 10% more than that. When they're running around Washington looking for sources of revenue, they ought to be looking this way. We're going to come to the fair tax one day, not out of a sense that it's the wisest thing we've ever seen, but out of the realization that there's no place else to go. The top 2% can't continue to pay the whole bill. We keep thinking that you can just raise the tax on those very wealthy folks, but there's no money there to speak of. It's in the middle class. And the other thing is that rich folks are pretty often smart folks. When Maryland tried a few years ago to raise some more revenues, they found 3,000 ultra-high income earners in Maryland, and they thought they'd draft a bill just to affect them. After all, they had a lot of money, and they're not going to complain. Well, a few months after that bill passed, they had 1,000 high income earners in Maryland. And I'd be surprised if they haven't all left. And you've seen the traffic out of California just recently. The fair tax broadens the base and lowers the rate. Everybody's treated exactly the same under the fair tax when that wealth of Warren Buffett is spent, and it will be spent, if not by him, by his heirs, or by foundations, but it'll be spent. And it'll be taxed at exactly the same rate as his secretaries, and he'll be proud. Let me close by saying this. The fair tax gives to the American people the ultimate gift that it is in freedom's grasp to give. The gift of anonymity. Never should an agency of government know more about us than we're willing to tell our children. Thank you. There's the first question. Back here.
From your knowledge of what the situation is, what would that fair tax rate be for 2014 if you had the absolute hire and fire and the ability to change the law?
Well, the fair tax is drafted so that If a hammer at Home Depot says $10 on it, $7.70 goes to Home Depot and 23 cents goes to the federal government. It's included in the price system, and it's a 23% inclusive rate. It could be less than that now to be revenue neutral, but I don't have that fight today. I would like to have that fight another day and just replace the 23% of what you're earning with 23% of what you're spending. Let this economy grow by leaps and bounds. Our research tells us that in the first year after the fair tax, you'll have a 10.6% increase in the gross national product. You'll have a 26% increase in exports, a 70% increase in capital investment. Those companies will be building plant in this country. That
happens to the state tax situation?
I can't affect that.
Under your
I can't affect that, but I came to Michigan, and one of the first visits to see a governor, I talked to John Engler at length. Of the governors that I've spoken with, of which have been several, maybe 10 or 12 over the years, all of them that have a income tax fix it to the federal income tax. What we think they do is fix their sales tax as an inclusive tax, get rid of all exclusions and exemptions, tax goods and services. We did a study in 1997, I think it was, in Texas, and their 8.25% sales tax would have been reduced to 2.25% and raise the same amount of revenue if it was an inclusive tax on all goods and services with no exclusions or exemptions. We think they'll do that.
Thank you.
Thank you for speaking. Mr. Mitchell said earlier that he saw the flat tax as a transitional tax on the road to something else. Do you see this along those same lines or differently?
No, I don't. I see this as an terminal station. If we can get rid of the tax on income and go to the tax on spending, I think that's as far, and get rid of exclusions and exemptions. We have to trust the American people not to let you raise it and let you keep changing it. The current system is such that the last 4 or 5 tax events have been promised to you that we're going to only increase the tax in the top 2%. And the other 98% said, go get them. I want the next tax increase to have a reason for it that's so compelling that you're willing to pay it and willing to raise your taxes. I think a lot of Americans would keep pressure on Congress not to let it be raised.
Thank you for your comments, sir. I have an excerpt here from a gentleman named Bruce Bartlett. He was a Treasury official under the first President Bush. So I'd like to read this excerpt.
I know Bruce, and I expect this is not a very favorable comment.
I would like to hear what your take is on his criticism here. He says, one consequence of the fair tax is to penalize those who are young who may need to borrow and consume heavily to establish themselves by buying their first cars, first homes, and all the furnishings that go with them, and possibly to pay for the costs of child rearing as well. He goes on to say, it also penalizes those who are older who have saved for their retirement during an era when saving was heavily penalized by the income tax. But rather than being able to spend their savings tax-free as they have anticipated, they will now have to pay sales tax on everything they buy, including health care.
I was in, I'll get to that. I was in Arizona doing talk radio on the fair tax several years ago, and a lady from Sun City was driving in her car toward the city, I think it was Phoenix, that I was in, and she called in, she said, I hate your tax. She said, I paid taxes and income, my husband and I paid the tax, we sold our business, now you're going to tax us once more when we spend it. I made the mistake of saying, consider your grandchildren. She said, I don't give a damn about my grandchildren, I care about me. The fact of the matter is she's already paying this tax. It's already embedded in the price of everything she buys. The people who are going to be wounded by this are people who have Roth IRAs because they've already paid the tax on that. If you have a regular IRA that's not a Roth IRA, you'll be able to take your money out of your IRA with no tax consequences. But the fact of the matter is we are a generational taxed nation. To think that we can look at one set of people and say, okay, here's how it's going to impact you is not a way to look at the overall tax circumstance because it's a generational tax. The fact is that young people are currently going to pay for us the way it is. If they buy new homes, that price is already built into the cost of that new house. If they buy used things, there's no tax on used things. Everybody's going to make different decisions. But this is going to give you the opportunity to be a voluntary taxpayer. And I'm going to benefit personally because I've got everything I own paid for. And I'll just have to pay taxes on my food and gasoline. But I'm going to give everything to my kids, and they're going to spend it, and they're going to pay tax on it at the same rate I would if I spent it. So Bartlett also says that the genesis of this program came from the Scientology, I think it was. I've never met Christian, not Scientologist, I guess it was. I've never met one, and I've been there from the beginning, so I don't put a lot of stock in everything he says.
I think you left out one advantage that I see about the sales tax. If the rate gets too high, people always have the option of not buying things. Whereas if the rate gets too high on income tax, they don't have the option of not working. And my question is, what do you do about the resistance you'll have with the internet crowd? Are you going to have the state sales tax agencies collect this, or will businesses report to the federal government?
The states collect it and remit it to the federal government. 45 states are currently collecting a sales tax. They've got the mechanism in place. They've got the fraud mechanisms in place better than we could possibly build at the federal level. We pay them a quarter of a basis point for doing that, or a quarter of a percent, 25 basis points for doing that. We pay the retailer 25 basis points for collecting it. But it's collected at the state level and remitted to the federal government. The federal government would have one division that would collect taxes on catalog and internet sales. I think we should tax internet sales for this reason. If you got a guy down the street who's built a brick building in your neighborhood, and he hires your kids and buys in your community and goes to your church and your Rotary Club and commits to the community, why should he be at a 7% disadvantage to Amazon.com? I think they should all be treated the same. We shouldn't be picking winners and losers. As to whether there'll be less consumption when the tax gets too high, I will point out that the consumption base in this country, going back to the early 30s, has been a fairly consistent base. It has none of the amplitudes of volatility that the income base has. For example, right now we have no corporate taxes to speak of, and a lot of people laid off not paying income taxes, and tax revenues are down dramatically. I think they're collecting about 15%, Dan, would that be fair, of the GDP on taxes, 16 maybe? And it's typical to collect 18 or 19. That's a big swing. So the consumption tax doesn't have those amplitudes of volatility, and will be more. It's a more steady predictor of economic activity than is income.
My question has to do with the prebate that you're talking about in dealing with the poorer segment of the population, that they would have
No, we're not dealing with the poor section at all. You're going to get this prebate. You sign up with your Social Security department and how many people live in the house, and the prebate will be sent to you probably through a application debit card, or through, like they're doing EBT now. You will get your cash distribution at the beginning of the month based on how many people are in the house, because we're not going to know how much you make or how you make it. So if low-income people are spending $25,000 a year for a family of 3 just to live, that portion of it will be untaxed. But if Bill and Melinda Gates want to move to the farm and spend $10,000 a year to exist, they'll be untaxed too. The prebate goes based on the size of the household, not the amount of income in the household.
Okay, so it's just across the board?
Yes.
This prebate that you're talking about?
Nobody should pay taxes on necessities. The only reason we use poverty level is to define what the level of spending on necessities is. And for a family of 4, that comes, according to this year's federal government adjustment, it's $30,000 a year. They'll be able to spend that untaxed because of their prebate. They'll pay the tax, they'll just get the money in advance to cover it.
Okay, thank you.
Much for your presentation. I have a quick question. How are you going to collect from cash-based businesses, beauty shops, restaurants, gas stations, party stores that historically underreport their income? In fact, their sales equal their expenses, and
Well, let's start
don't
out
pay
with the
any
premise.
taxes.
Let's start out with the premise that we're Americans and we cheat. But under the current system, all you have to do is lie in your tax return. And you've got less than a 1% chance of being caught. Under this system, you have to have two people conspire to cheat. Now, I don't know how many friends you have willing to go to jail to help you out with a few pennies, but I have none. We have, interestingly, we have about a $345 billion tax gap. That's tax returns that are sent in with the admission of the debt that isn't paid, isn't remitted. And if you go through the whole system, you find out that the federal government's collecting about 72 to 75% of what they know is owed. Under the sales tax, the vast majority of the money, 88% of the money on the goods side is going to be collected by the big box stores. I don't know who you know at Lowe's or Home Depot, but I don't know anybody's going to help me. On the goods, on the services side, the vast majority of the taxes are going to be collected by medical profession, and they have licenses to be concerned about. So I think you're going to have less. If we just collected the 72 to 75%, we'd have more money in the bank than we have under the current system, but we will have cheaters, I promise you that.
Sir, you expressed a great deal of confidence that the American people would prevent Congress from getting out of hand with the sales tax, either in terms of rate or specializations or so on. But that seems to be very similar to that which we have not been doing, by your own words, with the income tax as things have been changed over the years. What is the basis for your great confidence as regards the sales tax versus the income tax?
The George Bush tax increase of 1989 or 90, the Bill Clinton tax increase of 93, the most recent tax increase you've seen, all taxes have been promised only to affect the top 2% of the American people. And the other 98% said it's not going to affect me, why do I care? Remember the great Russell Long line? Don't tax him, don't tax me, tax that man behind the tree. The American people, if they're not going to be, if they don't think they're going to be affected, they just walk off. To raise the nationwide universal sales tax by 1 cent is going to affect you and everyone you know, and you're going to have a keener interest in it than under the current circumstance.
Thank you very much.
Where are we? Okay, I'm sorry.
Way over here. Under the Obamacare law, they are getting 16,000 more IRS agents to collect the various wonderful taxes in that law, which are tremendous. If you have a national sales tax, how do you get the Obamacare law modified so you don't have those agents doing the collecting and you don't have that specific source of income for that specific service?
It is my fondest hope that it will collapse of its own weight. I emailed several of my colleagues, or former colleagues, when these discussions were coming about, and they were putting bills forth to repeal Obamacare, and I said, what you need to do is change the subject and get the American people interested in a national sales tax and let Obamacare fall of its own weight. I don't believe that those taxes, they're now called taxes after John Roberts, I don't believe those taxes are going to be sufficient to pay the bill. I don't believe they'll be efficiently collected. I think that entire thing will fall of its own weight, and I really don't care.
Dr. Mitchell spoke today about the importance of a simplified tax system and the importance of taxing things that are in United States territory. If we impose a sales tax upon businesses on the internet, where does American territory stop and other countries' territory begin?
Well, we have 50 states and 5 territories, and I think that's American territory. I don't understand if people are collecting, if people are selling, though, to American citizens in our country, they're going to have to collect the tax. When we first started this, retailers came to me and said, there's no way to do this. And I said, well, Sears has been doing it for 60 years. If they sell catalog sales into a state in which they are a county, particularly if they have a business, they have to collect the sales tax for the state on it. So they're going to have to collect the tax.
Thank you. Our speaker earlier this afternoon told us the story of an event where he was speaking to what he thought was a friendly group, and turned out he was in the den of lions. Your proposition, as well as his, has a huge vested interest in keeping things complex. Armies of tax attorneys and CPAs and IRS agents and all the rest of that. How do you fight that battle?
We believed when we first started this in the 90s and introduced it in 99 that we'd never win this battle in Washington, D.C. We'd have to win it in Michigan and in Minnesota and Georgia and Mississippi. And we have volunteer organizations in every state now. Where the volunteers from Michigan are right here. These three folks and 4 folks. And the American people, once they catch on to this, will move Congress. Congress always moves according to the American people. I was giving a talk to a group of accountants who were specialists in the tax code. And one of them, who was an old friend of mine, when I got finished with the whole thing, he said, John, just give me a couple more years. In fact, they hate it. John Snow came to see me for a second visit on this when he was still Secretary of the Treasury, and I said, John, where you been? I said, I know what happened to you the last time you were here. I said, you went back to the Treasury, and I won't use her name, but she was Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Tax Policy. I said, she beat the hell out of you all the way back to the Treasury Department because you're even thinking about this. And he laughed and said, yeah, that's true. I said, well, she's now making $1 million a year gaming the code. The fact of the matter is, we can't move Washington. You have to move the people, and the people move Washington. We listen far more keenly to our constituents than we do to lobbyists. Lobbyists are the easiest people to say no to in the world because it's their business to take no's as well as yeses. But you can't say that very easily to your constituents. And when we move the country, and it's moving, you can't be a congressman in very many places of the country without getting questions in your town hall meetings about the fair tax. Stand up. They're Michigans for fair taxation. Well, he's an accountant. Let me say something about accountants. Accountants make a lot more money sitting down with their clients and charting the future than they do recording the past. And I haven't had an accountant yet complain to me about losing business. They work 16, 18-hour days for 3 months a year, just trying to figure out a code that some of the regulations have not even been written for yet, and signing their name to the bottom of the tax return. So I'm not the least bit worried about them. The people who make a living off it in Washington don't like it at all. And the members of Congress who listen to them a lot will not ever move on this until they hear from their constituents. But we do listen to our constituents.
Thank you. You indicated...
I can't hear you.
Oh, excuse me. You indicated that the states that have a state income tax would collect money for the federal government.
No, sales tax.
The sales tax, excuse me. Does that mean that the states would, in a sense, control the purse strings for the federal government? And would that give them leverage over the federal budget, deficit spending, and the federal debt and that sort of
No.
thing? No.
They would just be licensed to collect our portion with their portion and send it in.
Thank you, sir, for coming and speaking. Just on the constituents point, it makes sense that the constituent, or you would listen to your constituents. What happens when the constituents don't know what they want or are not sure of or understand the tax code? One of the things Mr. Mitchell talked about, we're not doing a good enough job of educating people on how these taxes work. How would you go about educating or properly moving the people, as it were?
He's correct, we're not doing a good enough job educating. But most of America understands the sales tax. They see it in 45 states. They see it, they pay it, and they walk away from it. They don't go back and recapture the receipts, fill out tax returns. They don't spend with their fellow Americans 8 billion man-hours a year, 7 to 8 billion man-hours a year just filling out paperwork. They understand it, and if they were given the opportunity to choose between them, I believe they'd choose a tax system where they could control how much they're willing to pay.
You mentioned that the fair tax would stop all of the other taxes, such as a corporate tax or a capital gains tax, from existing.
Any tax based on income would be gone.
What safeguards would the fair tax put in place to prevent that from happening in the future?
I mentioned earlier on that we have a provision in the bill. First of all, the bill just repeals all the taxes and gives you a different paradigm, a consumption-based tax versus an income-based tax. And then the bill says that if in 7 years Congress doesn't pass a repeal of the 16th Amendment, all the other taxes come back into play and the sales tax goes away. We think that's the closest incentive we can get. We can't mandate future Congresses to do anything or states to pass it, but that's the best incentive we could think of.
Congress cannot actively change the Constitution, so would they have to force some form of convention, or are you just kind of hoping that they'll ignore the 16th Amendment?
Well, Congress, if the American people will get up in arms, the Congress will act. And there is a proposal right now going about to use Article 5 of the Constitution to have a constitutional convention for the sole and exclusive purpose of opposing the fair tax. If that gets any legs and starts to move, the people in Congress not wanting to lose that clout and the control over this will move. Congress can pass with the 2/3 vote a change in the Constitution. It still has to be ratified by the states. And but the flat tax is going to take a constitutional change also, not to pass it, but to keep it. Because every time we tried to flatten it out, future Congresses have put us back into as bad a shape as we were before. So ultimately, the people are going to have to speak on this.
Thank you very much. I guess my question is, and it kind of borders on exactly what you're talking about now, how do you ensure Congress is going to keep and limit what it can do? We've trusted them to keep their promises in the past, and we're in the mess we are now. So how do we stop it in the future?
Well, we are a free society, and you get to vote every 2 years. If the American people want to vote for this, that's their prerogative. I think it's wrong. I was stunned when they voted to keep President Obama in place, but they did, and we can't change that. If future elections put in place a Congress that's willing to double the tax rate, and the American people think that's a good idea, it's their idea, and they get to do it. We cannot put constraints on what the American people can do as much as we would like to.
Thank you for speaking with us tonight. Over the past few years, we've heard with Occupy Wall Street and other movements about the 1% and the rich and the 47% and all these numbers, and I'm just wondering how the fair tax addresses the appeal of class warfare, or if that's not an issue that needs to be addressed.
It's just the opposite of that. It doesn't pick winners and losers. It treats everybody exactly the same. Everybody, Bill Gates and you, for your family, are going to get that distribution to untax you on necessities, and you're all going to pay the same above that. It doesn't pick winners or losers.
Thank you so much for speaking tonight. I love the majority of the policy effects predicted under the fair tax. However, as a limited government constitutional conservative, I'm completely appalled by the psychology of sending a government check to every household in America every month. Has any effort been made to find another way to untax necessities?
I'm in favor of changing the tax code. There have been many proposals in the past. None have had as many sponsors as the fair tax has, which started out this year with 52 sponsors. But the only way we accomplish solving the questions that I raised at the beginning, the tax decisions versus economic decisions for business, the embedded cost at retail of the current tax code, the compliance costs, the underground economy, the offshore economy, the only thing that can fix those is getting rid of the IRS. And the only proposal that I've seen to totally get rid of the IRS is a fair tax.
Sorry, I wasn't clear. I meant as part of the fair tax plan.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I meant as part of the fair tax plan to get rid of the check monthly to people. I meant as a total package, the fair tax, is there a way to do it without having that monthly check from the government to households?
That is an argument that it would take about 8% off the cost of the tax if we didn't have that prebate system going to households. But what we found in our research on it was the American people wanted to provide protection for particularly low-income people on the purchase of necessities. We felt we should protect everybody on the same way, so we did get into picking winners and losers. You can all learn about this on fairtax.org. But more importantly, you can go and get the bill. It's 132 pages. You can actually read it, and it makes sense. Please do that.
So I have a real quick question about how the sales tax would be implemented for non-physical goods, especially those, I guess, would it apply to some of those, such as buying stocks? If there's no tax on income, hey, let's say I want to go buy an insurance policy or some of these more abstract kind of financial constructs I can put my money into. Would a sales tax apply to those non-physical goods?
It would apply to the service portion of the cost of doing so. And the bank that wants to make you the loan would have to calculate what the service portion of making that loan is and charge you the sales tax on it, not the whole loan. The service portion of running the casino in Las Vegas, not how much you won, but how much did you incur in terms of service costs in providing the chips.
I have a question about tax brackets. Now, one of the issues with current tax brackets is that people who are in a low-income tax bracket, as soon as they step out of that bracket into a higher one, the marginal tax rate that they'd have to pay on their new income will disincentivize them to earn more money. Would the prebate act at all like a tax racket? Would it incentivize low-consumption families to continue spending under the prebate level?
The prebate is based on the number of people in the household, not the income level of the household. And we're not going to have any agency in the federal government that even knows what your income is. So there is simply, since everyone is getting it, there's no class warfare, there's no brackets, everybody's getting the same treatment.
Well, yes, my question is if they want to spend more than what they would be required to spend for necessities, will the fact that they're getting a prebate incentivize them to not spend more than, say, the $30,000 that the prebate allows them to spend untaxed?
I expect that that differs with every human being in America. Some will spend more and some won't. And it's not our business to know why or care why.
Upon the idea of the constituency driving Washington to move to a fair tax. Just wondering how I would convince my kids that this is a good idea. None of them is really aware of how much they pay in income tax now. It's withheld. And once a year they think about it.
When they get that check back?
Well, maybe. But
Maybe you just mentioned the quarter or the monthly prebate check. That might soften the blow. But I can see that it'd take a lot of education to the constituents to say, this is how much you really pay in income tax day by day, so that when you start to spend your national sales tax day by day, it won't seem like this is a whole new poverty, a new approach to poverty, and the government taking even more than you really thought you paid before.
I'm not in the business of trying to educate kids on how much they make. My son, when he started work, was furious how much that Mr. FICA man took out of his check for the first 2 months. And he got thrilled when he got a check back in April. I believe the average income earner is going to get about a 30 to 40% increase in take-home pay the day after this passes. And I think they're going to appreciate that, and they're going to be more concerned about where that money comes from and how they. We just can't. You know, there was a guy in Oregon one time who tried to do what you would like to do, and his Friday came, and he paid every Friday, and he had his workers come by his table, and he gave them the money for their pay, and then next stop was how much they're taking out for Social Security, and then how much taken out for Medicare, and the government shut him down. Now, I'm going to tell you something that is painful to me to admit, but one of the people most intimately involved in withholding in World War II was the beloved Milton Friedman. And they believed at the time that was the only way to go. Well, we're stuck with it. We're stuck with it. I think giving people a full check one time will open some eyes, but we can't delay moving, hoping that we can educate every last person, because we can't.
Thank you for coming tonight, sir. We're just thinking about your fair tax here and about how you're saying certain goods will be exempt because they're needs.
No, let me, this is one of the toughest things to explain.
Okay.
Nothing's exempt. Nothing exempt. The federal government every year sets a number that it says it would cost a household of 1, 2, 4, or 8 X number of dollars to pay for their essentials. It's called poverty level spending. And that's the number we use to send you your check. But we don't pick out essentials. We don't define them. We don't pick winners and losers. We send you a check based on the government statistic, or the government number established every January, I guess, as to what you need to spend in your household to pay for your essentials. You might take that check every year and or every month and go to the dog track. Not my problem.
I misunderstood. Thank you.
Yeah, not my problem.
I was taught that it's not a good idea to go to your barber and ask if you need a haircut. Within the context of that statement, I would ask you, how do you address the question of, would you go to your barber and ask him to pay the taxes?
The service industry raises this issue all the time, and my answer to them is, in fact, this came up in a talk before a group about this size of physicians from California and Washington, D.C. And we'd been talking for about 45 minutes until one physician stood up and she said, "What? You expect me to tax my patients?" And I said, "What makes you think you're so special? All your neighbors are taxing their source of income every day to pay for the government. Why shouldn't you?" Those service people, particularly service people, have an embedded cost of the tax embedded in their prices is more than 22%. They're already paying this. They'll come up money ahead and they won't spend fortunes with tax planning as they get older, because there will be no death tax.
Question. Are there any examples of any governments who have implemented a pure fair tax system? I know you mentioned that there were several mixed systems, but can you think of any of states who have implemented?
I don't know, and I'd be surprised if there were any, because every nation that wanted to add most of the consumption taxes added are value-added taxes, which I'm particularly opposed to, because although it's a very efficient way as Milton Friedman said, it's the most efficient way to raise taxes. It's also the most effective way to increase the size of the government. And so I'm opposed to that, but most of the nations have gone to a value-added tax, and they've added on top of their income tax to the point where in Europe they're typically taxing 40% of the GDP as compared with our 20+%, 20, 28, 29.
The used goods would be untaxed. Once you've bought in the item, it's been taxed as a new item. But how does that work in the industry where you mentioned that sales on Amazon would be taxed equally as a new good? I'm a seller. I sell used books on Amazon. I pay the Michigan State sales tax. I have a sales tax license for that business. But how would you differentiate many of the online sales, such as eBay and Amazon? There are regular people on there selling their goods every day. So how would you regulate the difference between the used goods sold online versus the new goods sold online?
Well, I think we can ask the people who are selling them if they're used or new, and we can have the audit system like we have in income taxes to find out if people are lying and punish those that are. Look, I can't say this often enough. We're Americans. We cheat. Some people are going to cheat on this. Some people, but you know what? There's probably one or two people in this room that have a corporate credit card or have had a corporate credit card and drove that car and that gas to pick up their kids at school. That's cheating. It wasn't for corporate business. So we're going to cheat, but we're going to catch it. If we just collect what we know is due, we'll collect better than the IRS is collecting today.
What are we going to do about grants and subsidies?
What?
Grants and subsidies?
Grants? Oh, this doesn't affect spending. This bill only affects the method used to raise the revenues. It doesn't have anything to do with how the revenues are spent, which is another big challenge.
Let me know if sorry about that. Let me know if I heard you correctly, that prices should not increase because the embedded cost of the current tax system is about the same as the cost of the fair, or as the amount of the fair tax. That's the first question.
Let me deal with that one at a time. Every businessman I know is going to try and keep that price in there. But competition isn't going to let them do it. First computer I bought was a used computer. It filled a closet in my office. It cost me $12,000. The last one I bought was 20 times as fast, 20 times as powerful, and cost me $500. Why don't they just keep charging me $12,000? Because competition won't let them keep the price in there. It'll drive it out because they're going to eliminate their share of the payroll tax. They're going to eliminate all of their embedded costs, and most businesses are very anxious to get market share, and they do that by lowering prices. What's your next one?
Okay. Second question is there a constitutional issue in terms of federalism in having the federal governments requiring the states to collect a national sales tax?
We don't require the states to collect it. We pay them if they do, but we've had several states come into this discussion and said if you find any state that doesn't want to collect the sales tax in their state, such as the states that do not currently have it, we'll be happy to do it for them for that 25 basis points.
Okay, thank you. What about payroll taxes? What happens to Medicare and Social Security? Gone?
The payroll tax is the most onerous tax, the most regressive tax there is in America, and it's gone.
Final question is home sales.
Yes.
Is there going to be, there will be a sales tax on new homes, but presumably not on used homes?
Correct.
And what do you expect the impact on the housing market to be?
It depends on what city you're in. It's going to change. All of this stuff is going to be difficult. There are no transition rules, only one transition rule in the bill. And there will be some dislocations. There's no question about that. The transition rule is if you're a builder or such as a builder of homes, and you have a bunch of inventory on hand on the 31st of December, the value of that inventory can be used as a credit against collecting the tax in the next year because you've already paid the taxes in that equipment and that resources that you use to build those homes. Any business that has inventory on hand at the end of December can use the value of that inventory as a credit to not collecting taxes on the new sales until it's used up in the next year. And there are no other transition rules in the entire bill.
Thank you, sir. This will be our final question.
Thanks so much for speaking with us. My question is, it appears that the Occupy Wall Street movement and a lot of those on the left are pushing their agenda using the argument of justice and what's the most just system. I'm wondering if your foundational argument for switching to a tax on consumption versus income is one of efficiency or creating better incentives, or if it could be argued from fundamentally a position of what's most just and how we can we present that argument to the American people?
Anytime I hear someone use the word justice, I assume they're coming from the left and they're trying to put something over on me. This is just, I don't know anybody who knows what's just. We've learned in the Obamacare Supreme Court decision that justice did not hold a very steady hand. So I want a tax bill that raises the same amount of revenue, but doesn't put us through so many contortions to get there. Every person in this room who's paid an income tax is a criminal because we paid something that we didn't, or we didn't pay something we should have, and we've done it wrong. Because or not half, but very large numbers of the regulations following tax bills are not written when you have to file your tax returns. I want a system where you go to a store, choose whether or not you want to buy that product with the taxes embedded in it. You know what it is when you walk out. It's over. It's all over. And April 15th is another nice spring day. Thank you.